Welcome to the Voices of War, a podcast with a simple vision to bring to life the true costs of war through the voices of those who've lived it. I'm Maz, and I speak to soldiers, academics, refugees, peacemakers, and anyone else who's been touched by war in the hope of demystifying and, most importantly, de-glorifying it. If you like what you hear, please consider showing your support by reviewing the show wherever you get your pods. You can also support us on our Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee page. Links to both are in the show notes. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this episode. My guest today is Dr Deane-Peter Baker, who is an Associate Professor of International and Political Studies in the School of Humanities and Social Science at UNSW Canberra, where he's also co-convenor, together with Professor David Kilcullen, of the UNSW Canberra Future Operations Research Group. He's also Senior Visiting Research Fellow in the King's College London Centre for Military Ethics and a Research Associate in the Centre for Applied Ethics at Stellenbosch University. Deane's work focuses mainly on the ethics of armed conflict. His current area of focus is on ethics and special operations, and he's a regular consultant to Australia's Special Operations Command, as well as the Australian Defence Force more broadly. He joins me today to discuss one of his recently published books, Morality and Ethics at War, Bridging the Gaps Between the Soldier and the State. I recently read this excellent book, and due to the ever-increasing complexity of modern battlefields, find it not only relevant, but also very timely for just about every military in the world. Deane, thank you very much for joining me on the Voices of War.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So you've been a military ethicist for many years now. Maybe we can start by finding out how this journey began and what motivated you to pursue this particular career path.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that many people start out wanting to be a military ethicist. It's certainly not on the usual kind of list of career paths. In my case, I kind of wandered into it. I had always had an interest in the military. I had a brief period of service in the British Army and as a reservist in the South African Army, excuse me. But my academic career took me down the path of philosophy, and I didn't really think of any great way those two things would meet, and I didn't have in mind to join them up. But as an undergraduate, I dated a girl who was a young woman, I should say, we were young men and women back then, who was a nurse, and I didn't think to check on her family before I started dating her, and discovered that she had 3 older brothers, one of whom was a semi-professional rugby player and a bit scary, one of whom I'm not sure, but may have been a gun runner, and the eldest brother was a special forces soldier who had left the military and was working for a company I'd never heard of at the time called Executive Outcomes.
Right.
And you may have heard of Executive Outcomes,
yes,
probably the prototype private military company. So I met them, ended up breaking up with this girl, and went on with my life and studying philosophy. And then some years later, I turned on the TV, and there was this older brother on TV being arrested for his role in an attempted coup in Equatorial Guinea.
Oh wow!
So I thought, wow, this is really interesting. So I did what academics do and decided to run a conference. So I ran a conference on private military contractors, and that's kind of how I stumbled into military ethics.
Wow, that's a very insightful journey, I guess, and also shows a little bit of wisdom on your part to.
Well, I don't know, opportunism perhaps, but it's been really interesting ever since. Another funny part of that story is I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Blood Diamond.
Yes, of course.
But the gentleman in question was actually the advisor to Leonardo DiCaprio on that movie, and his character is modeled on him. So it's a strange world. Oh wow, okay. Well, what I meant by wisdom is that you got out of that relationship and ran quick smart, absolutely.
given the older brothers' profiles. But it certainly also I guess landed you in a pretty unique career. And how did you find your way to then Australia and particularly UNSW, where I've like I said to you before we started, I feel like I've known you for years, and that's because I've seen your name so much around the traps of the Australian Army, and I've done a couple of your courses, online McCoo courses. How did you end up here?
So yeah, as I said, I was in a normal university, I suppose, a civilian university teaching philosophy. I kept teaching these because I got interested in it, these military ethics courses. And of course, my students were like, why are we doing this? But so I got interested enough in it, and we decided we wanted to move on from South Africa, where we were living at the time and where I was working. So I applied for many jobs and managed to land one of them, which was at the US Naval Academy in the Department of Leadership, Ethics and Law. So I taught there for almost 3 years, and then got offered this job at UNSW Canberra, and very similar roles. So UNSW Canberra, for listeners who are not aware, is the academic partner to the Australian Defence Force Academy. So our undergraduate students are trainee officers of Army, Navy, and Air Force of the ADF. So it was a very similar role, and Australia is great. So it was a no-brainer really to come over.
Yeah, and I've gone through UNSW ADFA myself, so I certainly understand how that process works well. And this book in particular, I mean, to say it's timely, and I think you actually write in the opening, and of course, Major General Susan Coyle also in the foreword of the book addresses the timeliness of it. Why did it come out now, and why is it important now? This particular book. So I'll just read the title again. It's the Morality and Ethics at War: Bridging the Gaps Between the Soldier and the State.
So, a great question. Why now? In one sense, it's just a case of this is the moment in my career when I was ready to write this book. But in another sense, it's a response to a growing recognition, I think, that we're seeing of the challenge of particularly of moral injury. I didn't set out to write a book about moral injury, but that is a big part of what it became. And I suppose in a way it's me stepping back from my career of training and educating future and current military personnel in the area of military ethics, and stepping back and trying to put this all into a kind of broader context and trying to see where I guess the cracks are in the system. So it all kind of came together around a project that I ran to create a course for 6th Brigade. Susan Coyle was commanding officer of the brigade at the time, and that gave me this wonderful opportunity to write this up.
Yeah, and for me personally, it really did speak to this need to address what the relationship between the state and the soldier. And of course, it's very contemporary right now because of the alleged war crimes conducted by some members of the Australian SAS. But of course, it's relevant to the UK, US, just about any military in the world right now. But of course, it's very relevant right now in Ukraine as well, where we're seeing this role between the state and the soldier really play out on the Russian side. In fact, we're seeing it on both sides, but I think we can unpack it and draw the distinction a lot clearer on the Russian side. Before we delve into that, what is the main thesis of the book? Or maybe what is this ethical gap between a state and a soldier that needs to be bridged that you're trying to address?
So I try to draw a distinction between morality and ethics in the book. So when I say morality, that there's a difference, ethicists will give you different answers to that question, but I tend to follow a Canadian philosopher, Charles Taylor, not to be confused with the Liberian war criminal of the same name. And Taylor has a really neat way of drawing the distinction. He says that ethics is about what it's good to do, and morality is about what it's good to be. And I think that, for me, has been a useful framework in thinking about the individual soldier, and I say soldier, I'm obviously referring to anyone in military service, but the individual who is a moral being in a rich and deep and all-encompassing sense, and trying to draw a link and quite unique sense as well, and trying to think about how that connects up with the ethics of war, which are very thin and narrow and tied to the nature of the state. So that's really the underlying idea, is to try to think about that, the gap between that individual and the state that they serve, and how we can bridge that, because I think that there are risks if we don't, that where there's a gap that's not bridged, that's at least one potential cause of ethical failure on the battlefield, war crimes, and so on, which has strategic impact. But it's also, I think, a potential cause for moral injury for the individual. And so that's what the book is trying to address.
And I'll definitely want to get to moral injury. But what did you mean by that the ethics of the state is slim and narrow? What does that mean?
And maybe I struggled a little bit in trying to express that in the book, and still struggling. But what I'm trying to say is, in a liberal democracy, at the core of the idea of liberalism is the idea of freedom, that individuals who live in a state should be free to develop their lives as they see fit, to have their sense of what's valuable, what's good, what's right, what's wrong, as far as possible, but obviously within some bounds. So those bounds are defined by our effect on others. We don't harm one another, and so on. So that fundamental idea of freedom, I think, limits the kind of ethical framework that a state can have, that a liberal state is appropriate, that it's appropriate for them to have. So we don't live in a world where we have we don't live in a country anyway, where we have a very deep and thick and rich sense of what the state wants the individual to be as a person. And that wouldn't be appropriate for that. So I think the ethics of war for the state have to be this very kind of thin and minimal thing that's just enough to hold it all together, but that doesn't try to turn the combatant into something he or she is not necessarily.
Okay, and just to push on that a little bit more, because I'm just trying to visualize the difference, for example, between Russia right now, because it could very easily, and I'm sure Putin and his henchmen are arguing that point, that this is all about Russian freedom and freedom from oppression. And, one could almost argue that, what he's doing right now, the ethics of the Russian state right now is to pursue the freedom of the Russian individual. So I'm just trying to see where the distinction or the point of difference is between, the narrative we're selling versus the narrative that someone like Putin is selling.
Well, I don't want to claim to be any kind of Russia expert.
No, of course.
But my impression, let's put it this way, is that while Russia is describes itself as a liberal democracy, or as a democracy anyway, it isn't really. It's an autocracy, and what that means is that while there is potentially talk about freedom as being central, that's not really what's driving things here. So I think we've got to be careful not to get caught up by the propaganda, by the words that are said. And I think, again, is this really about freedoms? Well, I don't think it is. But I guess I'm trying to get at this from a kind of broader position, again, trying to think about that individual and their relationship to the state. And that's where that tension lies, I think.
Yeah. And the only reason I'm asking that point is because I think it really is relevant to us in the West, because I think we often can fall for our own traps of our own narratives. And the reason I say this, for example, war in Iraq, it could very easily be argued that the war in Iraq had nothing to do with freedom. And then that goes down to the relationship to, how does that shape and influence the soldier who's on the ground? And I think this is what your book does exceptionally well, is really draw this tension out between the causes for the jus ad bellum, or the justification of a war, versus the jus in bello, or the conduct of war for soldier. And that those two somehow need to be threads between those two that are robust and dense enough so that the soldier maybe believes that what the soldier is doing is just and ethical. Unless that unless that happens, we can then start sliding into this kind of murky waters of loss of purpose, loss of sense of self. And I think this is where you talk about moral identity and having an individual moral identity. Can you describe what you mean by moral identity, and how does the moral identity actually link to this overarching ethic of the state? And here I go lean back on my early philosophical career again and refer to the work of Charles Taylor. And Taylor, I think, is very insightful in trying to understand what we are as human beings. And for him, and I think this is
essentially right. We are inescapably moral beings, not in the sense that we're always good. We certainly are not, but rather in the sense that we evaluate the world inescapably in broadly moral terms. We as we go through life, we're always making judgments that some things are better or worse, higher or lower, right and wrong. That's an inescapable feature of what it is to be a human being. And people who didn't have that would be completely beyond our ability to actually engage and understand. And so he drills deeper into that with that initial recognition that we have this inescapable way of viewing the world. What does that mean about us? And he thinks if we dig down, we identify that we align ourselves with a range of what he calls goods. So values that we hold as very important to us, that define who we are and where we think we stand in moral space. How are we doing? Am I good or bad? Well, I'm judging that by some sense of what I think good or bad is. Am I closer to it, further away, to these goods? And these goods define a kind of framework. And that framework is in many sense like the analogy is like your spatial environment. That you define yourself in terms of those things that are around you. I'm closer to this landmark and further away from that one, and I'm moving towards that other one. And the idea of a moral framework is that defines us in some deep and inescapable kind of way.
Can I just jump in there with a question as well? Because I think that that's a really important piece of the puzzle, in my mind at least, is the moral framework, which to me is almost the software that's running my mind, or the algorithms inside my mind that dictate ultimately my behavior as I interact with my environment. So where do moral frameworks come from, and how do we, I guess, install the software into our mind, or even upgrade it, as we progress in life?
Yeah. So I think we our framework develops throughout our lives. It starts with our parents, or whoever raises us. We get some of it from our peers. We get it from our culture. It's what Taylor refers to as our webs of interlocution. Interlocution is that others that we are in engagement with. And this builds a very unique framework for each person. Nobody has exactly the same framework as somebody else. And this is really what makes our identity so special and so valuable. And this is, and one way of linking that to the previous discussion was, this is exactly the sort of freedom to be that person that the liberal democratic state exists to protect. That the things that you value that define you should be free to be able to do that.
Okay, so again, in my head, and I'm a visual kind of learner, so I'm seeing kind of multitude of Venn diagrams, and on the middle there's an overlapping one, which is our collective values, whatever that you say in Australia or liberal democracies. There's a certain set of values, and freedom would be at the core of that, and of course there's a whole range of other values, that we at least. Some of them might be pipe dreams, but at least we aspire to uphold, whether it be equality, whether it be freedom of speech, pursuit of excellence, and all of these kinds of things. And then, of course, from that center, there's all the other individual Venn diagrams where we might have other identities. I mean, I might be in the army, you're a professor. That in itself is a different social identity governed by its own values, I suppose. Right. So.
Or they'll be the same values, but we weigh them differently. They take a different place in our framework.
At an individual level, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And of course, by that, we're saying also that soldiers, we have certain value system inculcated in our soldiers, which is driven, I guess, top down from these values, and we aspire our soldiers to uphold. And I guess the core essence of your book is that it is these values that then need to dictate how we conduct ourselves on the battlefield. And this is what we would refer to as the jus in bello, or the conduct of war, or the rules of war, which is effectively what we've inculcated in our soldiers.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
So
the question for me is, how do we do that without changing, or if you almost violating that individual framework? Again, if that's an overarching principle of our society, that you should be free to develop that on your own. How do we get all of these people who have different frameworks to connect to abide by the same ethical principles when it comes to war fighting.
Yeah,
I think that's the real challenge.
Yeah. And this then leads me to my next question. And this is the way I see it is the ethic is the jus ad bellum, the state's decision to go to war that is governed by certain principles. And then, of course, below that is the jus in bello, or the conduct of war, which applies to the soldier. And it strikes me as though we don't, as a society, hold those two to the same level of scrutiny. In a sense, our leaders, and this is something I've discussed elsewhere and previously, our leaders who send us to war can fundamentally do so with relative impunity. No one's going to drag our political leaders over sending our soldiers to war. In fact, if anything, their popularity will go up, at least at that point in time. But then as we cascade down, it is the soldiers that we then ultimately hold to account. And this is, and I said in some of the questions I sent to before this, there's one part in the closing remarks of chapter 1, which you highlight some really credible criticism of the just war tradition, and I'm forcing my own programming to change to just war tradition after reading your book, because I fell for the trap of calling it just war theory, and your book explained why it's not. So I'm changing now to just war tradition. Now, but the only side issues taken with jus in bello. So the conduct, transgressions only by combatants in war, and you leave out any transgressions of jus ad bellum or those sending us to war. Why is that? Because I think, particularly when we're talking about the title of the book, it's the bridge between the state and the soldier. So why are we not focusing on the jus ad bellum?
So I think for the book, the focus is on how do we help soldiers not make bad decisions on the battlefield, and not fall into ethical failure, and also how do we prevent them from suffering from moral injury. And I guess that's given the book more of an in bello focus than an ad bellum focus. But having said that, I read that section again, and I think you're right. I think that's a bit of an oversight on my part, because I do agree that the ad bellum is really important in both those respects. And having that right is really very key. I mean, traditionally, the just war tradition, and I've also used to call it the just war theory, so I'm also guilty, but I think it's better to think of it as a tradition. Yeah. But historically, that there's been a very clear distinction between ad bellum and in bello, and there's good reason for that. The point of that distinction is to protect the combatant, is so that the combatant is not held responsible for the decision of the government to go to war, which may be a decision to go to an unjust war. The idea is to protect the combatant from that, so that they don't end up having to be held as war criminals because they fought in an unjust war. That their job is to make sure that they carry out that war in a just way. So that's the reason we've had that sharp distinction. But in reality, it doesn't go all the way, does it? That it does matter where we are in terms of is this overall thing a just war? That is important. So I agree with you. I think that was just a bit of an oversight on my part.
And I certainly didn't mean to come across as I'm picking holes. It's mainly because I think this is a really relevant point that I just feel like we're not, and I'm not sure if that's an institutional failure that we as or as an organization, whatever it is, that we're just not addressing. We're dealing with issues inside the bubble, but we're not looking above the bubble, what's actually creating the bubble. And that to me feels like there's a disconnect, because that, of course, then ultimately contributes greatly to moral injury, as we'll discuss shortly. But there's one question that just popped up into my mind then as you were talking. So can we fight an unjust war justly as soldiers? And this is obviously a big question that's been asked previously. It's certainly nothing new, but it's an important one given the context of the book.
Yeah, look, I think that comes back to that issue of why we draw that distinction between ad bellum and in bello. I don't think as soldiers we can fight in an unjust war and come away from it completely untainted. But if we have conducted ourselves, and I say we have, I've never done it and probably never will, But if soldiers have conducted themselves, if soldiers have conducted themselves appropriately, they can at least walk away going that with the sense that what was in their control they did right. And I think that's really important. It's not going to be 100% of a protection against moral injury and potential feelings of shame of contributing to something that was inappropriate. But I think it is very important.
Yeah, and I guess that's the challenge. And I asked this as an officer in the army, as one who served overseas. I certainly haven't been on the front lines in any way. Never fired a shot in anger, but I certainly can empathize with the blurry line of, a war that in itself can be is a shade of grey as to its justifications. But then how does that influence me doing my duty? Because ultimately everything I'm doing is as part of soldiering is to fight an enemy or to defeat an enemy and to pursue operational success for my force. But if that force is there for all the wrong reasons, then there was a real, and I can really relate this now to I guess the Russian soldiers, what they're experiencing right now, right? So they are in and I think we can comfortably say that this is an unjust war. Invasion of Ukraine is an unjust war. I think one would find it very difficult to argue otherwise, unless one was sitting in the Kremlin, which of course is a very different view. And those soldiers are now being told to fire at civilians. It's a very blatant breach of Geneva Convention, of what the moral instinct of a soldier is, to protect as opposed to harm civilians. But they're carrying out those soldiers because for them, the narratives that they have to embrace in order to even be there, lest they commit suicide by not being there, i.e. turning back and deserting, that's the slippery slope. Now, this is a rather extreme case, and we can quite clearly draw the lines. But for us Western nations, where we certainly wouldn't target civilians intentionally, it's a little bit more of a grey area. Is there a point that you see, or at least that you've wrestled with yourself, where soldiers, or our leaders at least, need to question the state's ethic? Need to question whether a war meets jus ad bellum, and if there is a clash, what does the military do given its contract to the government of the day? So it's a really challenging one.
I think it's one of the key questions, and it's a vital one. I like the term General Milley, who's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the US. He had this term disciplined disobedience. I like that in the sense that, and he's talking really across all levels, but I think that the military in general should have the capacity for a kind of disciplined disobedience. And what do I mean by that? Well, Peter Fever, who's at Duke University and is an outstanding scholar on civil military relations, he's got this catchphrase which is very memorable. I think it's right. He says that in a democracy, elected civilians have the right to be wrong. And that's a fundamental notion of a democracy, that it's not for the military to make decisions about policy. They're not elected to do that. Having said that, if we're in a situation where an elected official is suggesting or proposing or driving a course of action that is clearly unethical, I think that there is a responsibility on the behalf of the military to point that out. We don't really see enough of cases of particularly senior military leaders resigning in the face of orders to go to war that are unethical. It would have been good to see more of that in, for example, 2003 invasion of Iraq, because that has an enormous power. Now, it doesn't, that's got to be done carefully and not to undermine the democracy, but it is a power that is available, that disciplined disobedience. And I think that that's something we need to be training people for from the beginning at the small level. your immediate superior says do this, and that's problematic. To be able to speak up and say, not sure that's right, sir. Not sure that's right, man. Having that as a I suppose a culture, I think is important, because then when people are at the top, they have the ability to stand firm. I've actually just last year had a student finish his PhD under my supervision, arguing that what he calls the general, as in the Australian context, CDF, should have the right to refuse on the grounds of conscience, and for it not to be an illegal act, and for it not to be a requirement that she or he at that point resign, which is a really interesting argument.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, I'll get some details of you on that, because I think that's certainly an area that I'm particularly interested in, because I think that is part of what a democracy is as well. And I really do like to point that it is about a democracy. And democracy, I recently heard a very neat way to think of democracy, that it's not on or off. There's no on or off switch. It's more like a dimmer, right? And you can kind of dim the light, and there are various stages of democracy until it kind of turns into the darkness that is no longer democracy. And it's very easy for those stages to kind of drop off, and for us to, no, that's what my superiors told me, or that's what the government wants me to do, and that's what I go and do, and that's what we do in democracy. But ultimately, it is those very non-reflective responses that will lead us outside of a democracy, right, into potentially. And I'm not saying Australia, but certainly there's a risk of that. This then takes me, I guess, to the more, I guess, on the front lines piece. Which is really what the book, as you rightly pointed out, it is written for the practitioner of war. That's how I saw it. It really tries to wrestle with some interesting ideas about what makes us do what we do on a battle space, and of course, how any ethical transgressions can occur. No one is born a war criminal. So what makes otherwise good people turn bad?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? Yeah. If I had the answer, I'd be very rich. But so I think there are a wide range of reasons, and we're still coming to understand all of them. But what I've focused on in the book, and it's really only a very, very small part, I guess, of the answer, but is what I call ethical risk factors. And since writing the book, I'm now increasingly referring to these factors as ethics inhibitors. I think it's certainly the case that we might find transgressions being carried out by people who are just bad eggs. But I think there is a problem with the bad egg theory, in that it's too easy, right? That too often we go, well, they're just a bad person, and so we move on and we don't learn anything. And I think that there are certainly occasions, and I know this from my own experience, and I'm sure everybody does as well, where people who are generally sound ethics find themselves doing things that they realize retrospectively they shouldn't have done, that they wouldn't normally have done. And so part of the thinking is, what are those conditions that lead otherwise good people to do things, to make bad ethical decisions, poor ethical decisions? And this is a fascinating field. It's a too small field so far, but it's starting to grow. And it's thinking about those kinds of factors that can lead to those bad decisions. And I'll just give you one example. So there's a fair amount of evidence that human beings are reflexively racist and sexist, that at our most instinctive level, we automatically draw distinctions between people on the base of race and sex. And
there's a reason for that, right? There's an evolutionary reason for that.
Exactly. Yeah. So why is it that most people, thankfully, are not that way in their behavior? Well, it's because we learn that that's actually not a useful or sound way to distinguish between people. It's not an ethical way to distinguish between people. And so what happens is we learn, and that the part of our brain that is dealing with that is our forebrain. And so it's essentially what's happening is our forebrain is overriding our more instinctive more primitive brain processes. This is very poor neuroscience on my part, but roughly speaking. And so anything that interrupts our ability to engage our forebrain in that kind of self-control way puts us at risk of making poor decisions in terms of racism and sexism. So things like being very tired, obvious things like being taken by surprise, right? The evolutionary brain is designed to react very quickly when it's taken by surprise. And the way the brain does that is by just bypassing the forebrain, which takes a lot of energy and time. And so we make very quick decisions, and those are usually very self-protective decisions and not always in very ethical ways. And so thinking about those kinds of things that can lead us to make those poor decisions and understanding them better, I think is really crucial in getting to grips with where these things happen.
That's wonderful. That just reminds me of a discussion I had with Dr. Douglas Fields, who is a neuroscientist, and he wrote a fantastic book called Why We Snap. And basically he's figured out that there are 9, this is all ones and zeros, zero social science in it. It's ones and zeros, pathways in the brain, 9 of them that if triggered, we will snap, and uses a very interesting mnemonic, life morts, and, all of these different triggers, like threat to life. There is no thinking. It's an immediate response, fight, flight, freeze, whatever it is, or an insult. And that really, what you're saying there is really, in my mind, there's creating a connection between, how our ethics and our moral compass can be degraded beyond the rational, beyond the thinking mind into a reactionary mind. And I think this is a really crucial piece of understanding war and battles. And this is something I spoke with David Wedham at length as well, particularly in relation to the IGADF. It's something that I think you dedicated chapter 6 complete to these risk factors, and to me personally was the chapter that spoke to me the loudest. And I found it interesting that our recently published ADF ethics doctrine, chapter 6 in there as well, talks about risk factors. So I'm not sure if there is
there may be a connection.
Yeah, that's right. I thought there might be a subtle link there. And I found it welcoming to see it in our ethics doctrine, as much as I personally would like to see it develop a lot more and maybe even sit, in chapter 1 or 2, because the way I see it is, and I've argued this point previously and written a few things about it, that I feel like we can't talk about jus in bello without understanding the context. Like we just talked about, no one is born a war criminal. There are, my kind of a light bulb moment. I had a light bulb moment when I was reading about Kurt Lewin and his call it formula, but that behavior is a function of the personality in the environment. So, the personality one carries, and that is partially nature, partially nurture. Of course, there's a lot of research on personality, but it is the interplay with the environment that will dictate behavior, which is why anybody is susceptible to doing the wrong thing if only the right conditions are set to trigger their personality to do a bad act or an act that we would subsequently call a war crime. Which is why I think your point, for example, about sleep. I've been in the army for many years. I've been out for a while, but it's not something that, yes, we all know that we need to sleep, but it's not a mandated you are to sleep. Particularly on operations, after deployed on operations, sleep is a luxury because the environment is such that everything is buzzing. You need to be, moving. You need to be contributing. So I guess the question is, how do we bring the importance of all of these environmental and context factors into our discourse, firstly, and secondly, then how do we replicate the tensions that are created in the environment in our training, so that the first time we're facing an ethical challenge is not on the battlefield, but in a controlled, safe space.
I think that's a fantastic question and a really important issue. And look, one of the things that has struck me as I've looked into this kind of research is how little of it has actually been done in the military context. So we've learned a fair amount from, the broader psychology, neuroscience research, most of which is done as most research is on university students, because they're
free labor.
Exactly. But actually, we've not really done a lot of the research that's specific to the military context. So I think as an academic, as a researcher, to me, the first answer is we've got to understand this stuff better. We've got to actually do the research. That's going to take investment. That's going to take time and effort. But if we really want to mitigate these factors, we have to understand them properly. And then can we really be effective in incorporating them into training? But we can start doing that already with what we already know. I've been doing some work with SOCOM for a while, and one of the things we've worked on is a tool for designing ethical quandaries to go into training, so that when firstly it's going to happen, right? So that it becomes normal for people who are designing training to think, where are the ethical challenges in this? I need to make sure there are some, and that the trainees are being confronted by these ethical challenges, that there's some kind of feedback mechanism, some kind of follow-on education that happens. And that needs to happen. The problem is that where it does happen, which is a good thing, it tends to be a bit ad hoc. It tends to be, well, I had this experience, or I heard about this case, so I'll build that in. But to try to do it in a more systematic way and go, what exactly are we trying to identify as the ethical, particular ethical challenge associated with this particular bit of training that we need to do? And then how do we design an ethical quandary accordingly?
Yeah, and one that reflects our collective moral identity, right? Rather than an individual soldier's moral identity, because as we said before, we all come from, we're put together from various different identities that form the soldier, so to speak, on the day. And I think designing training, that's the challenge, I guess, is designing training that will sufficiently trigger various environmental factors within the soldier, and then throwing them into an ethical dilemma in order to train them to respond in a way that we want our moral identity to, collective moral identity to respond in such a situation. And that, I guess, is the real challenge, right? Absolutely.
And it's not just about throwing people into the challenges, but giving them a way to respond to it and having a common language to discuss these things. When I mentioned my last job, I taught at the US Naval Academy, and they have a fantastic ethics education package course there. But in the early days, what they tried was just having students look at a bunch of case studies and discuss them. And they found that without a framework for them to lay over those issues, it all became a case of, well, my opinion is this.
Yes.
And there was no way to develop some kind of common view, some kind of overarching sense of who we are and how we tackle these things.
Yeah. And I wonder, what do you think? I mean, I get the sense that it stems from a little bit of naivety about war, and those who've experienced real war, I'd be surprised if any of them would genuinely be able to say that, we can have wars without atrocities. I mean, it's and Clausewitz would agree with this, right? I mean, as well, that, the mass violence in support of political aims, that's what war is. So what do you think? Is it possible to fight a war without atrocities and ultimately something we can then later call war crimes?
I have to think that that's possible, because I'm in the business of trying to make that happen. And I do think the longer a war goes on, the more likely there will be atrocities. The more intense a war is, the more likely there will be atrocities. And so maybe it's idealism, but we simply have to aim at that. That has to be the goal.
Well, it's like democracy, right?
Right. And here we're distinguishing between atrocity and things like collateral damage, which is inescapable. Collateral damage is tragic, but it's not necessarily an atrocity. It can be within the rules of war. So, I mean, the just war tradition is all about trying to navigate a pathway between two truths. One is that war is sometimes necessary, and the other is that war is always terrible. And so we're always trying to tread this path that allows enough freedom of action to be able to actually fight wars, but at the same time, it's always trying to reduce as much as possible the suffering that war brings. And that's a difficult path, and it's a compromise, but it doesn't have room for atrocity.
Yeah, no, I well put. I mean, I think it's reducing the probability of things occurring, and that's what training is supposed to be. I'm personally convinced that there will always be something that one could then ultimately interpret as an atrocity, in any war, and that's because an individual might just snap, right? Like what I was talking about before with Douglas Fields, because he's lost, 4 of his mates, because his mum just died at home. It could be a myriad of reasons. He hasn't slept. He's been living on Red Bull for the past, 3 months, et cetera, and something happens and he just loses it. But I think that the point being is that we need to reduce the probability of that occurring, and that's what our training should be all about: is to create such conditions that we can actually test for that. Yeah. Is it possible to create those conditions, and how have you seen it done well? I mean, are there some, particularly this kind of replicating the environment that is the battle space to then test for these or train, I should say, not test, but train for these ethical challenges?
Well, let me step back and make a broader comment, then I'll try to answer that. I do want to say that it's not just about when we snap. And so I try to distinguish between ethics inhibitors or ethical risk factors that are of that kind, of that, where we just make a snap decision. We also got to recognize the enormous power of our social groupings on us, that this idea of ethical drift, this idea of normalized deviance. This is the other part of that equation that we have to understand better and have to deal with. And I think it can be done. I think, again, we need more information on the causes and how we mitigate them. But I've seen some good examples. So I last year had the opportunity to participate as an observer only in the Commando Sergeant's course, and observed a number of the training serials that they did, where they had deliberately put into them some ethically challenging aspects that were very, very well done, and the feedback was really appropriate. So I'm hugely encouraged as to what is possible. I think we can do it. We just need to become automatic. For me, if we're doing ethics as a thing on the side, we've failed. Ethics has to be just one of those drills that we do, just one of the many aspects of decision making as we go through. Yeah.
I think the issue is that it, seemingly seems so complicated, but really, when you boil it down, it's not. But you talked about ethical drift, and I really like that phrase. And here I'm going to refer to an example, analogy you gave when you spoke to Harry Moffat some time ago on a podcast that he co-hosts, and you used the submarine as an example. Can you just detail that particular analogy that you use? Because I think it's a useful way to think about moral drift or a useful way to visualize it.
Yeah. So, and for me, I'm a simple-minded guy, so these kinds of things are helpful to me as well.
But not. I've read your book. I don't believe that.
So essentially, if you think about yourself on a submarine, everything around you is in a fixed distance from you. The people, they're moving around a bit, but your whole sense of space is kind of fixed. You don't have windows on a submarine, and so you don't really have a sense of the movement that's going on for this whole thing. And our social environments are often like that they become very enclosed, particularly if you think of a unit on deployment, right? You are detached from all other social inputs. And so you just don't see when you're drifting. And that's not because you're bad. That's because we're human, and we relate ourselves to those in our immediate vicinity, and we take our cues from them. And if those cues have shifted, well, we may not notice. So for me, it's key to have some kinds of what I think of as ethical circuit breakers. So ways to burst that bubble, if you like, to reconnect you in with the broader world, with the bigger norms of the institution. And thinking about what those look like, I think, is really important. Sometimes it's as simple as having someone you trust who's an outsider who can come in and see what you're doing and go, actually, you're drifting. Like, why are you allowing this to happen? Oh, I didn't realize. And it's a very, very human problem. Also, it's not just a kind of observation. It's been shown in lots of studies as well.
Yeah, it's again, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's a really visual way to picture how this occurs, and particularly say on a deployment. What about, and I think it's particularly relevant for our special forces who work in smaller teams, usually more isolated than everyone else. What do you think the word special within the special forces means and does, or what does it inculcate within those particular soldiers? Because I think that's potentially part of this cultural piece that you're talking about. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think those identities are very, very important.
And just a caveat. I've got a lot of special forces friends who I admire and who are absolutely champions of moral and ethical decency. So just to give that as a caveat, this is not a slight on our special forces in any way.
Absolutely, but look, anything that's going to set you apart is a little bit risky, and it needs to be there needs to be some awareness of that, and that has to be managed. Interestingly, Sterling, when he created the original British SAS, was very adamant to his people: don't think of yourselves as elite. So he was concerned about that term, right? You're not an elite force. You're special because you do different things, but you're not elite. Well, we've almost kind of switched the meaning of those things around.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so we do have to, terms matter and words matter. And if our mottos tell us something, we believe them. If our labels tell us something, we do tend to be affected by them. I think those are really, really important issues that we need to think hard about.
Yeah, and address. And this is maybe a nice pivot, because just moving from the kind of submarine again piece, which to me again speaks so well to me because it's so visual. This moral drift, and then when one comes back from a deployment, it is this is the time, I guess, when the thoughts come back and you realize and you reflect based on what you're witnessing in your everyday society and what's back at home, that potentially you had a moral drift. And this, of course, then leads to potentially moral injury. What is moral? How do you define? And again, this is it's like culture, right? It's one of those terms that's yet to be clearly defined. But how do you define moral injury?
Yeah, as you say, it's something that's very much a hot discussion still underway. But I see moral injury in terms of that earlier discussion about moral frameworks. So it helps me to think of a person as fundamentally a moral being as defined by this structure. And to be a moral injury is anything that happens that so affects that structure that we become no longer able to function in the appropriate moral way in the world. And that can be two kinds of injury. One is where, think of it as the equivalent of a being hammered by a body blow that breaks a rib, right? You don't walk straight anymore because you're in pain and you're suffering. If we experience something or do something that radically shakes or even dislocates that moral framework that we have, that sense of who we are and why what we do matters, that affects our ability to behave and to act in the world in the way that we used to do. Now, I'm not saying all moral shocks are of that kind, right? I think we can have moral pains without being morally injured. And I think that's an important distinction. So that's one kind of moral injury. And, usually these symptoms, I think, are you experience overwhelming shame or guilt or anger, something like that. And it's affecting your ability to live life in the way that you did before. But the other kind is, I think, equivalent, and it's usually where it's kind of repeated exposure. Think of, we don't always think of this as an injury, but think of a callus, right? You do some job again and again, and you use some kind of tool over and over, and you rub one part of your hand against that tool over, and you build up a callus. And that's a self-protection mechanism. But it's actually an injury because it means in that spot, you cannot feel what you should be able to feel anymore. And I think the analogy, morally speaking, is that we can become literally callous, and that's a kind of injury, because we are no longer aware that of situations that actually demand an ethical or moral response from us, but we've become desensitized to that and unable to react. That's a different kind of moral injury, and I think one that's largely overlooked in the debate at the moment. And I should acknowledge, I get that almost entirely from my colleague Ned Dobos, who's much smarter than me. So, but I think it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I'll be speaking to Ned in due course as well. Because I think for that very reason, because this is really kind of his wheelhouse, and a conversation I look forward to. Maybe now we can move on, because you in the book you set out a way to perhaps prepare our soldiers or protect our soldiers with a particular type of ethos. Traditionally, we're embracing the warrior ethos, and I spoke to Shannon French about this at length. The warrior ethos. She wrote a fantastic book on it, and there are lots of positives in the warrior ethos. But of course, the warrior ethos, much like the word special, culturally has potentially been infused with a certain callousness almost, which is the kind of is the noble warrior who's going to do the things that no one else is ready to do. And of course, under a supreme emergency, right, which is we won't necessarily get into, but we embrace those people. But you talk about a different type of ethos that we ought to inculcate within our soldiers. What is it?
Well, I propose this idea of a guardian ethos, that's the identity we should be building. And again, it's not something that I made up. It comes sort of originally roughly from Plato, and I pick it up from Professor Pauline Shanks-Cowan of the US Naval War College, who's written quite extensively on this. And I think she's essentially right, that it's and of course it could become sullied and changed in its meaning, but as things stand today, I think it's a more helpful mental framework for soldiers than the warrior idea. And as Shannon's excellent book points out, there is lots of good in the warrior ethos. The problem is that, for me, it's focused on the what and not the why of war. So it says, what is this? It's war. What am I? I'm a technician of war. I'm a practitioner of war. It doesn't ask why. And I think the Guardian says, why am I doing this? I'm a protector. I'm here to guard and protect my people, but also unless it's absolutely impossible for me to do so, to protect the lives of others who are not Australians, who are not on my side. And I think that's a potentially a way of thinking about that identity that could help us to make better decisions, have a better scope of things. So, the warrior thing, for example, we tend to seek, if we think warrior, we tend to connect with other warrior cultures. So there's been a rash in recent years of identification with Vikings, for example. But actually, what was the distinctive thing that Vikings did? Rape and pillage, right? That's the term. We've got to be really careful about building those connections, what we're doing, because that's actually not what the military is there to do. The military, the core connection is with the society the military serves. And I think the Guardian does that connection better, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. And which is why you said before, words matter, symbols matter. These things are communicating something. Non-verbal communication is a real thing, and we pick up so much just from a symbol, a flag. People will die, for ultimately a piece of cloth because of what that symbol embodies. And the same with words. So I really couldn't agree more. I'm also speaking to Professor Pauline Shanks-Cowan in the near future as well. So I think I'm onto something here.
You are.
Speaking of the Guardian, and just kind of pivoting back to the Jus ad Bellum, how do we instill the Guardian ethos into our politicians? How do we do that?
That's a really good question, and that's something I've had very little success in. I've had, from time to time, tried to insinuate myself into the political world to try to give talks on military ethics or Jus ad Bellum, with no success. But I think people imbibe what they see expressed in culture, and if what the military expresses to the culture is a guardian ethos that will influence and impact on how decision makers view the military. And I think that potentially could help. And again, it's not going to replace the need for better education for decision makers on the ethics of war. That's an ongoing need that I think has never really been addressed. But I think it would help. Whereas that issue of, if they're the warriors, then it's about war. Okay, they're the experts in war. That's how we think of them. Or if they're professionals, it's another term, and I don't dislike the term professional. I certainly use it a lot. But again, I think it's a little bit too narrow, and it's a bit neutral. It doesn't say why we do it. It's just that we are the experts at this thing. And so I think that idea of guardian gives an overall mental picture of what is it that we're doing when we fight.
Yeah. And to me, on top of that as well, where I see the conflict is particularly for politics, it's all about interests, right? We're trying to merge this interest versus values tension within our soldier, within an individual soldier, right? Because even the mission of the Australian Defence Force is to protect Australia and its interests. It doesn't say to protect Australia and its values, right? So there, within that itself, there's a clash, because it might be in our national interest to go Iraq, and many will argue that it is, but it's certainly not within our values or value system. So now we're trying to kind of, the old round peg in a square hole type of thing. We're trying to squeeze our soldier, infused with these values and morality and ethics, to go and fight a just war, driven by these values, but for the interests. So I think there's a pretty big clash there that we are yet to really openly discuss, let alone address.
I agree, and look, it's not unethical for a state to pursue the interests of the nation, of the people of Australia. I think that's what it's there to do. But sticking by the values that fundamentally underpin the nature of that state is the most fundamental interest we have, because otherwise our society becomes something, it's protecting something in a way that doesn't match up to what it's protecting, which just doesn't work, and that will undermine the nature of the society.
Maybe my last question to you, and this is one that's really tailored to the practitioner. You talk about, and you kind of towards the end of the book, you talk about the ethical triangulation. What is ethical triangulation, and how can we apply it?
So ethical triangulation is one attempt at a decision-making, an ethical decision-making model or framework, if you like. It's not a theory. It doesn't work as a comprehensive ethical theory or anything like that, or theory of philosophy. But what it's trying to do is to give a fairly simple way of looking at an ethical problem that will help to mitigate the limitations of the different main approaches to ethics that we have in our society. So the three main approaches we have are deontological, where it's kind of principle or rule based. These are the rules. Think of something like the 10 Commandments, right? These are do this and don't do that. Or we think in terms of consequences. So the right thing is to do the thing that's going to result in the best consequences for those affected. Or we tend to think in terms of character, of virtues. And each of these is a very powerful way of looking at ethics, but they will sometimes get to different answers. And the question is then, so which of these should a soldier of a democratic state choose? Well, I think the answer is we shouldn't choose, because these are all three fundamental, if you like, the ethical outworking of fundamental strands that define the liberal democratic state. And I think if we choose one, we become unbalanced and as an arm of the state. And so for me, what's useful is to look at an ethical problem through each of these questions. And so the first is, what are the principles that apply? And usually that amounts to a question of respect for others, most centrally. What does that tell me? What are my permissions and constraints, right? Then I think, okay, but I don't stop there. I do need to think about the consequences. Consequences do matter in ethics. We don't go, well, I just follow the rules, even though the consequences might be catastrophic. So I have to ask myself, do the consequences sometimes change my calculation? Do they mean I emphasize one of my constraints more than others, or one of my permissions over others, or do the consequences outweigh what is normally a permission for me? So if you're thinking of the Jus in Bello, I have a permission to kill enemy combatants, right? That's the heart of the principle of discrimination. But necessity says, the principle of necessity says, but only if necessary. If the consequences that people will die unnecessarily, that outweighs your permission, right? So it's the same sort of logic going on there. And then the third step of triangulation is to think about character, because what that does is it makes you turn your eyes back on yourself and go, what about me? And particularly, what are my limitations as an ethical thinker? What are my vices, to put it in terms of virtue theory? I know, for example, that I'm prone to be rash. Many military people are there because they are act-centric. So there's a danger there that they would tend to want to go do something. Well, maybe sometimes the right thing is to do nothing. And knowing that about yourself, having that self-reflection of awareness of your character, will enable you to then kind of check back on your proposed course of action and go, okay, but is this just my character skewing my decision-making here? It's not a perfect system. It's not going to give you a mathematically correct answer. But what I think it does is it gives three ways of looking at a problem and each compensates for the weakness of the other.
Yeah, and absolutely wonderful. And I think the important piece is that it can be trained for and discussed and debated in a training environment, which would then, of course, lead to the awareness of that triangulation principle, in a combat zone in an instant. It can make it instinctive, of course, through the right amount of training and practice that we apply to it. Dean, as I expected, this was an absolutely wonderful conversation. I'm very grateful for the time you've given me, and thank you for writing the book. I think it's a really important book, and one that I've certainly already talked about a lot with some of my peers, and certainly one that should be read by anybody in uniform, regardless of what type of work they do, because we are all susceptible to, the moral drift. And of course, our moral identity is what will drive it. And of course, all of that in hope that we can prevent poor decisions on the battlefield, which ultimately then lead to moral injury, which certainly degrades the force going forward. Thank you very much, Dean. I really appreciate it.
It's great being here. I really appreciate the invitation. Great chatting to you, Matt.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Voices of War. And since you got this far, please consider showing your support by liking and reviewing the show wherever you catch your pods. Also, if you're able, please consider showing your support through our Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee page. Links to both are in the show notes. Thank you, and until next time.